Hey Whappers, welcome in where tonight's topic, coming to you live from the middle of the day, is on China. We've been away from China for quite some time, focusing more on Africa, the spread of Islam, Middle East, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, but today we're back in Asia. And really, the overarching big picture topic that I want to stress today is how China is going to really grow to new heights, especially during the post-classical period. And China is going to really emerge as the world's leader in technology, growth of population, culture. China is, at this point, the center of it all. And what we have to sort of appreciate is the evolution of China since the Han Dynasty fell, which is when we last left off with China. Now, the Han had fallen. They were attacked from outsiders. They had the internal problems with taxation, peasant uprisings like the Yellow Turban Revolution, and the Han Dynasty eventually fell in the early 200s. And for the next 300 years, China went through another warring states period, although this was called the Six Dynasties period. 6 different families ruled various parts of China. It was decentralized, it was fractured, it was another power vacuum. But eventually, a dynasty solidified and unified various parts of China towards the end of the 500s. And so that's right at the beginning of our classical period, our post-classical period, I should say, post-classical, and that's the Sui dynasty, S-U-I. The Sui were one of the first Chinese dynasties in the post-classical period. And I want to give you a couple things to remember about the Sui. The first is the growth of Confucianism. Once again, we're going to relate Confucianism to a Chinese dynasty. And the Sui were leaders in Confucianism. They solidified Confucianism, they brought it into the government, it was a big part of their society, their culture. So keeping that theme alive with the Sui dynasty is Confucianism. But probably most memorable for our purposes with the Sui is the growth of China in and of itself. China was exploding in population, much in part to massive new cities and improvements in farming, which we'll get into later. But Chinese population was growing, cities were becoming larger, and China was on the verge of an economic revolution in which it traded and extended its boundaries further than ever before in Chinese history. And a significant contribution from the Sui was the construction of an aggressive canal project known as the Grand Canal. And the Grand Canal was a major construction project done by the Sui dynasty, which, although the Sui dynasty lasted a very short period of time, the legacy of the dynasty rests in its Grand Canal, a canal that still today is widely utilized in China. The Grand Canal's significance is that it connected northern and southern China via waterway, and especially to connect them out into ocean travel and ocean trade. So now we've got both the Silk Roads via land, and you've got more ocean travel for the Chinese to extend their boundaries and go further into parts of Asia. And the Sui really are responsible for the growth of China as far as especially the Grand Canal. But the second dynasty we're going to get into tonight, and this is going to be a very brief ATW, the second dynasty are the Tang dynasty, T-A-N-G. And the Tang dynasty's great contribution to Chinese history really comes down to technology. And so I've always told my students in the past to relate the Tang dynasty with technology, T and T, they kind of go together. The Tang dynasty rose to power shortly after the Sui, and the Tang dynasty, their contributions to technology, let's just kind of whip through a couple of these really quick, and then we'll talk about culture and whatnot, and we'll be done. Some great technological advancements occurred during the Tang dynasty, a dynasty that lasted 4 centuries. We're talking some evolution here with technology, especially, for example, woodblock printing. The ability to print Chinese characters on woodblock was a significant step towards the eventual creation of a printing press and being able to print books on paper. Well, the Chinese were way ahead of the game, and they used woodblock printing, which was a precursor to Europe's version of the printing press, and this allowed China to flourish in terms of literature. In fact, the Tang dynasty is considered to be the golden age of Chinese art and literature, much in part to its development in being able to print symbols on woodblock printing. Another technological advancement was medicine. In fact, some of the first recorded cases of diabetes and checking people's urine for sugar count was developed during the Tang Dynasty. Incredible how far advanced this dynasty was to have awareness of diabetes, which is clearly, an incredibly difficult ailment for medicine to crack even to this day. So knowledge of diabetes was present during the Tang Dynasty. Other Tang Dynasty accomplishments, you have certainly the evolution of military technology. China had already developed gunpowder. Playing cards, I know that sounds somewhat trivial, in the grand scheme of things, but, we talked a little bit about how chess evolved from India. Playing cards, like the invention of playing cards came from the Tang Dynasty. And also even air conditioning and certain fans to circulate air, during warm weather months was a technological breakthrough that the Tang achieved. So when we think of the Tang, we want to think of technology, but we want to think of another T as well, and this is maybe the most important thing I'm going to talk about with the Tang Dynasty and their role in Chinese history, and that is the tribute system. This is a big one, and this is something that's going to become a legacy that the Tang pass on to other empires in China. The tribute system was a way for China to exert its dominance around Southeast and East Asia, and you'll be reading about this in that article that's due on Friday. The tribute system was a form for the Chinese rulers to exact control through intimidation, not through force, but through sheer intimidation. And the way that the tribute system worked is that the Chinese would go into territories nearby. Let's just take like Korea, for example. And so while Korea had been conquered already during the Han Dynasty, under the tribute system, local neighboring territories near the Chinese would have to offer Chinese bureaucrats, people that were part of the government, the Confucian system of government, they would have to offer them goods to be exchanged for trade. In return, the Chinese would allow these neighboring territories to maintain their political autonomy, meaning that these places could sort of stay independent of China. They weren't conquered, but the Chinese intimidated with the sort of threat of invasion, all in return for trade. And this is how the Chinese spread their influence all throughout Southeast and East Asia, and even parts of Central Asia as well, too, I should say. The tribute system was for the neighboring areas to pay tribute. That's kind of where the term comes from, but to give gifts and to trade with the mighty Chinese imperial government, all in sort of return so that these local places could remain independent. Now, in some cases, you may be wondering, what happens if these neighboring places refused to participate in the tribute system? Well, that's when the Chinese would come in with a show of force, conquer those territories. But as a result of the tribute system, there is just incredible amounts of both diffusion and syncretism that occurs. A great example of this during the Tang Dynasty, I mentioned farming earlier, and the Chinese had long developed expert farming techniques for rice cultivation. But a lot of their techniques were improved upon over time from neighboring territories, like Vietnam, which is in the southern, close to southern China. Now, Vietnam is part of Southeast Asia. And in Vietnam, rice cultivation was a way of life. It was one of their main staple crops. But the Chinese incorporated rice cultivation from Vietnam to improve the Chinese process of rice cultivation. And as rice becomes now the staple crop in China, consequently, Chinese population is going to continue to grow. And as I told you before, whenever you see population growth questions on AP exams, typically they like to link together food and new sources of food. So, this is just one example of how the tribute system worked. And Vietnam was one of those territories that was part of the Chinese tribute system, as was Korea, as was parts of Japan even. And you'll be reading about all these in the next night or so. So understand with the Tang, it's technology and tribute. And then the other part I would just talk about is the philosophy. Confucianism again reigned supreme, but Buddhism did spread persistently throughout the Tang Dynasty. And although Buddhism was not the main philosophy of the Chinese Tang Dynasty, Buddhism was spreading throughout China. We talked about the two different types of Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. And so, Mahayana, I can never say that darn word, and I'm almost at the end, so I'm not going to re-record. Mahayana Buddhism was spreading throughout China during this time period. So, again, We'll make some sense of this tomorrow. Make sure you write your questions down. And we're going to introduce yet another Chinese dynasty when we get through the video. And whatever questions you guys have left in the video, we'll cover those tomorrow. That's pretty much it. We got this in under almost 12 minutes here. So hopefully tonight's ATW went smoothly for you. Ask questions tomorrow. We'll make some sense out of the Sui and the Tang. And as always, this is me signing off, reminding you that the past shapes the future. Have a great night, Whappers.